Raji, welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Nara, and thanks for having me here.
Let's begin with talking about what exactly is space security.
Space security, I think it can mean a couple of different things. One, how you use space assets for security-related functions, security missions, military on non-military options, but security functions and so on and so forth. But the other aspect of the security of space assets in outer space or on the ground infrastructure that is used for space functions. So it can mean a couple of different things, and the space security challenges, of course, from multiple perspectives are growing, not just for India, but I think across the entire Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, as we used to call, or even globally. I think the competition is picking up in terms of the space security dynamics.
How did you get started in the space security realm, and is this something that was present within the Indian context for a long time?
No, I got into space and space security. I think this was about a slightly more than a decade when SIPRI reached out to us. The SIPRI is considered the mother of think tanks, this Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So they wanted to do a conference on the Indian space program, and I was quite eager to be part of that because, if there is going to be a publication that's going to come out from SIPRI, I wanted to be part of that. But I think I had some bit of prior background and more of the technology issues. For instance, my PhD was on US technology export control policy as it applied to India. So I did have some technology related interests, and at least the technology policy, how it played out and so on and so forth, especially during the time till about 2000s, for instance, the US and India were not on the same page. So that technology, politics and policy, how that played out, I had some interest on that. But this came, the space conference from SIPRI came, and I thought that was a fantastic opportunity. So I started looking at, for instance, the India's own changing space orientation from a purely military, peaceful and civilian application, and shifting somewhat more towards the security side of things, the military operations, military options in terms of using for what we call the passive military applications, surveillance, intelligence, and reconnaissance. And this has come to be somewhat more accepted by all militaries around the world, that you would use space for passive military applications. So India was moving in that direction for quite some time. But then it happened, you had the first Chinese successful ASAT test in 2007, January. And I think that prompted a bigger dialogue, bigger kind of conversation in the Indian context. And I think this was the time I was slowly getting into that the domain. And I also saw that there weren't too many people working on this area. There were at that point of time, and even now, the number of people who work on these set of issues is fairly a small number. It's a small community. And I thought that there was also an absence of the Indian perspective at some of the multilateral and regional platforms, whether it is the ASEAN Regional Forum or the European Union or the UN related institutions. There was an Indian perspective missing. Of course, ISRO and the other folks from the Indian establishment have always been part of these deliberations, whether it is the meetings in Vienna, for instance, at the UN-USA, UN COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. All of these meetings had fair amount of Indian representations, but ISRO, most of the time, they were more of an observer rather than taking an active part in and contributing to, in that sense, to the conversations in these multilateral platforms. So I found an opportunity to get involved more in these kind of debates, providing an Indian voice as to how India, and an Indian perspective, because I would not say that I managed to summarize all the various Indian viewpoints, but at least I thought it was useful to provide an Indian perspective on some of these emerging major, bigger issues with regard to space, in a sense, provided primarily from a strategic and security perspective, but I thought that was still a useful thing. So since 2007, there has been an increasing debate within India as to how India should respond to the Chinese ASAT test. Until the Chinese ASAT test, India by and large considered that these are these are more expensive toys. These are big boys toys. We don't need to be concerned about them. So we left it primarily to the US and Russia to, they were the big boys in this club, and they would have to deal with all the militarization of space, weaponization of space, or even the ASATs. India did not play as much of an attention to ASATs in that sense from India's own direct security perspective. But 2007 ASAT test by China was a wake-up call for India to the kind of security challenges that lie in its own neighborhood. And space being a global common, it did not matter if it was near neighborhood or not. But even then, I think China's conducting of that test was surely an eye-opener for India to the kind of sophisticated capabilities and the kind of militarization efforts made by China in our own neighborhood, and that how China could also use space to sort of deny space to India, or deny an advantage to India in terms of its ability to use space in the military context and so on and so forth. So the 2007 ASAT test was something that had a more determining effect on India's space program. Since then, I think we have become much more, and I think this also led to conversations across the board. For instance, you have the political leadership. Then Defense Minister Pranab Mukherjee talked about it as to how India needs to develop its own kind of deterrent capabilities. You have Anthony talking about it. Later, he became the defense minister. You also have the Air Force leadership, as well as the Indian Space Research Organization, the ISRO leadership, talking about it. So there were a number of statements that came from across the board that articulated the need for India to develop our own deterrent capabilities, our own ways to protect our assets in outer space. So this has been something that's been going on for quite some time now. And I think by 2012, then DRDO chief, the Defense Research and Development Organization head, Dr. V.K. Saraswat, came out and said, we do have the building blocks, but at the end of the day, in India, this was going to be a political decision. And Prime Minister Modi, of course, took the decision in March 2019, at least we conducted the anti-satellite test in end of March 2019, which was after the political go-ahead was given for the test. So that's where we are, and I believe we will be developing additional capabilities to secure our assets as a deterrent measure. But I think we are not going to stop with one ASAT test, and that India has plans, at least going by the statements and materials that are available from the DRDO website in a sense.
It's fascinating that you remember the dates and the chronology of the people so very well.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been a bread and butter for the space security people, I would think. Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the interesting things that I wanted you to comment on is why was space security not such a big topic when India was emerging with its own space program in the 1960s or the 70s? Because I would say that that was when the hot topic of using space for weaponization and militarization was probably much more hotter than what it is today, with no rules established between countries. So why do you see this narrative of space security increased after the Chinese tests in 2007 against India not being so vocal about it in the 1960s?
No, India was absolutely vocal in the 60s and 70s. Not as much in the 60s, but the 70s and 80s, India was extremely vocal. In fact, I wrote a longish piece for the India Review, which is one of the peer-reviewed journals. We had brought out actually a special issue sometime in November 2011, where I tracked essentially the kind of statements and changes that are coming about, the fluctuations in India's policy following the 2007 ASAT test, looking at primarily the impact of the Chinese ASAT test on India's space reorientation. But there have been a few other articles also. And where I kind of look at, for instance, in the 70s and 80s, we were extremely vocal, and we were vehemently critical of the US and Soviet ASAT program, as well as the whole trends towards the weaponization. So weaponization is not entirely new, but the big difference is that the space domain was primarily dominated by two players at that point of time. You could still talk about limiting the impact of some of those trends because it only had two players primarily, and also to write rules of the road, to write some sort of whether it is a normative exercise or to engage in a legally developing a legally binding mechanism. All of those such exercises were much simpler, much easier, because you had limited number of players to deal with, in a sense. But India was absolutely always critical. And I think Indian position began to change sometime in early 2001. And one of the first instances that I can track, I can remember, where India began to change, or at least began to have a more nuanced position on some of these issues, was India's response to US President Bush's missile defense speech in May 2001, where he talked about as to how we need to look at missile defense system and so on and so forth. And I think India did begin to see the effect, or at least the impact of that, even in the Indian case. For instance, if India, because India was already beginning to field the threats, the missile and missiles, as well as other nuclear security, nuclear challenges, both from China and Pakistan, especially the proliferation that has been happening from China to Pakistan. So this has always been a growing concern. And of course, the proliferation of short and medium range missiles, the M9 missiles and M11 missiles, which China developed only for export purposes and which China had given to Pakistan, which was a growing concern in India. So from the late 90s onwards, India has been scouting for a missile defense system and so on and so forth. In fact, then leadership had talked about with President Kalam, who was then kind of scouting for the best technology available. He went to the US, he talked to the Israelis and so on and so forth. So India was already kind of beginning to appreciate the need for a missile defense system. And then Bush's speech happened. So Prime Minister Vajpayee actually immediately congratulated, within a few hours of his speech, Prime Minister congratulated on this particular thing, on this particular step, and saw the utility in kind of moving towards that. But of course, the domestic criticism was quite sharp at that point of time. And once again, we were going back to a position saying that space must be used for peaceful purposes only, and so on and so forth. And that's been India's rhetoric. So if you look at any number of statements at the CD, the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, which is a UN body that is responsible for space from a strategic purpose or arms control perspective. Statements at the CD, statements in Vienna, the COPUOS, or even in the Indian Parliament, you look at any of the Indian statements, we always emphasize the use of space for peaceful uses, and non-weaponization was emphatically sort of highlighted. But since 2001, India began to have a somewhat more relaxed approach to this issue and began to see the utility of India, for instance, the need for India to develop some of these capabilities, and therefore began to go slow on this. But again, India went back and forth. And I think India, whenever it came under sharp criticism in the domestic context and so on and so forth, India began to once again move back to the old comfortable position, saying that, yeah, we will use space only for peaceful purpose and so on and so forth. In the 80s, otherwise, India was very, very vehement, very, very critical, very loud and clear about where India stood with regard to weaponization, anti-satellite tests conducted by Soviets and the US. So I think we were not shy about it at that point of time. From the 60s onwards, we have been making claims about, we have been making very loud statements about where India stood on some of these issues. But I think what is today somewhat more problematic for India is the fact that you have a neighbor who's developing many of these capabilities, not just ASATs, but whole range of counter space capabilities, and that it might have a direct impact on India's security. I think that is much more pertinent for India in that sense. And I think India is therefore once again beginning to make that assumption about what we need to do. So one point, the difference between the earlier decades and now, one, it was that India was also a developing power. Even now, India is a developing country, but even so, I think India's capabilities in this domain was a lot more nascent. India was pursuing a space program purely for its social and developmental aspects. But today, India's space program has grown much beyond just the social and economic aspects to looking out for communication, looking at for India's ISR requirements, looking for PNT, the positioning, navigation, timing functions. So India's space program has grown to sort of integrate all the different sets of requirements and functions, whether it is in the social domain, economic, or weather predictions, or military and hard security related requirements in a sense. So I think with the growing set of requirements, you also needed to be much more concerned about what's happening in the space domain and how India's assets. We have made significant economic investment in this regard. Therefore, we also have a stake in what's going on there and what might impact on how it might impact on our own limited assets that we have in place. And I think if you combine the kind of services associated with our space program, as well as the economics, including the ground infrastructure, I think we have a sizable stake, economic stake in our space program. And therefore, we are that much more concerned about how we are able to maintain space as a safe, secure, and sustainable domain going into the future.
You did explain two terms that were very interesting, and I think we can dwell down a little bit for the average listener.
Okay.
One is
Sure.
weaponization, and the other is the militarization. What do they
Right.
actually mean?
So absolutely, I think those two terms are so interchangeably used by a lot of people, but I think they mean two very different things. One is that it is, for instance, militarization is something that has happened for a very long time now. That is, states continue to use military space assets for a number of military functions, mostly what it is called the passive military applications, which is essentially primarily the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and so on and so forth. But I think we are even earlier in the 70s, for instance, I think even those kind of aspects of use of those aspects of space use were somewhat more restricted, and there were issues about it. But I think over a period of time, states have continued to sort of come to the understanding that these are acceptable, these are okay to be used, and we should not worry about it. So, and especially if you look at the 1990, the US military operation in Iraq and the subsequent military operations in Afghanistan and so on and so forth, has clearly shown how space can be used as a force multiplier. And other militaries around the world, particularly China, has studied the impact of how space had facilitated the US military operations to a large extent. So there is that particular aspect that others have studied. And that's a significant difference that I see between the Cold War and now. During the Cold War, space was used mostly for strategic function, so it's early warning systems, execution of arms control agreements to verify those agreements, and so on and so forth. So space had somewhat a sort of a limited use, and primarily from in the strategic domain. But today, space has permeated to conventional military operations, and that makes it trickier. Since 90s, the US has been using space in a big way in their conventional military operations, and seeing how they have been doing very successfully, others are also kind of copying that, and others have learned to use space in a much more effective fashion in their conventional military operations. So that is giving way to militarization up to a point is fine, but I think the minute you start weaponizing outer space, and I think that's the dangerous trend, putting, again, a clear definition of what is weapon in space or what is weaponization. I think it's very, very, very a tricky thing to clearly define, because I think any object that is sent to space can be used in a nefarious fashion. It can be used in a dangerous fashion to deny your adversary an advantage, in a sense. So space can be used. Anything that is there in our space can be used in that sort of a function. But I think essentially we can start trying about, for instance, China and Russia, they have a draft treaty in place. It has not been accepted as yet, but the draft treaty for the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. So Russia and China, for instance, they say that nobody should place weapons in outer space. But my bigger point is that you don't necessarily have to put weapons in space to weaponize outer space. No country, no sane country in their sane minds will actually put a weapon in outer space. Today, for instance, you have the Outer Space Treaty, which came in 1967. It talks about limiting the placement, or it restricts countries from placing WMD, weapons of mass destruction, in outer space. But it's completely silent about other sorts of weapons, conventional weapons in outer space. But my own sense is that no country is going to actually put a weapon in space, but without doing that, without actually placing a weapon in orbit, you can actually weaponize space. And one of the first and earlier demonstrations. So the last ASAT in the previous era, when you look at it, the last of the ASAT tests, I think that happened was done by the US in 1983. But in 2007, China broke a couple of decades moratorium, that unwritten moratorium that existed, and gave way to a fresh competition in the ASAT, for instance. So the return of ASATs with the Chinese anti-satellite testing, the first successful anti-satellite testing in January 2007, was a major development. Then it gave way to next year, the US conducting its own ASAT test, the burn frost that happened. But the US test happened in somewhat similar altitude as that of India's ASAT test in 2019. We were doing it about under 300-kilometer altitude, whereas China's was done at a much higher altitude, resulting in a large cloud of satellite orbital debris, which is going to float around for decades now. It's not going to go away that quickly, burn up that quickly. So ASAT test is one way of weaponizing space. And ASAT, therefore, I would say it has an inherently destabilizing property and characteristics in a sense, and should have been avoided. If China had not started that ASAT test, I would think that we may not have gone down that path. And I think increasingly there are more countries going to go down this path. Japan may be one, because Japan has already allocated some funds for the next year, in the next year budget cycle, for the development of some sort of an interceptor capability. France is already talking about, they released a national defense space strategy last year, and I am assuming that they would be developing some sort of an interceptor capability for themselves as well. I wouldn't put it past when I look around. I think there are several more countries that can go down this path in a very quick fashion, and all driven by the security kind of competition that is picking up in a space. So ASAT is one set of things. Then you also have co-orbital ASATs. So these are things, again, you don't have to shoot, place a weapon in outer space, but you can use assets on the ground to target assets in outer space, space assets. So it doesn't have to be necessarily placing a space weapon to weaponize outer space. Then there are a series of other counter space capabilities. You have a lot more cheaper and easily accessible counter space technologies like cyber or electronic warfare in outer space. Radio frequency interference, because a radio frequency interference can happen because of the crowded nature of outer space, but I think there are also intentional attacks of that kind to create disturbances in a certain radio frequencies and so on and so forth. But cyber and electronic warfare have been used several times, more as a way of testing and sending a message to the adversary at this point of time, not to create a long-term disruption, but they have created temporary disruptions, or gone all the way up to taking the control of command and control of a particular satellite in certain operations, but just left at that. So in a sense, certain countries, China, for instance, has been exercising this particular option in the last almost for a decade now, has been targeting the US satellites on a number of occasions. I wrote a paper last year for the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDER, looking at the space, cyber and electronic warfare in outer space. So I tracked down each of these incidents that have happened. So it's sort of these are already happening in a sense. And then you have a range of civilian activities, but that can actually now begin to kind of create problems in outer space. A whole range of activities such as, for instance, the rendezvous proximity operations, or what you call the on-orbit satellite servicing options, in a sense, kind of capabilities that you develop for such purposes. On-orbit satellite servicing, essentially these refer to repairing a particular satellite or your satellite refueling and those kind of activities, so that you can extend the life of a satellite in a sense. So these are already happening, and but these capabilities can also be used in a dangerous manner, in a sort of, if you against a particular adversary, especially during conflict, how that might be used. I think that is given way to a lot more problem. In a sense, we are not clear as to how some of these capabilities might be used. Again, to remove satellite debris and so on and so forth, because debris has become a huge challenge. Most of the debris is a result of the fact that there have been several countries operating in outer space for several decades. So there are old spacecrafts, junk of that kind. But there are also man-made debris because of an ASAT test and so on and so forth. So there's a huge amount of space debris that is floating around there that needs to be cleaned up if we have to be able to continue our access to space in an uninterrupted fashion. So states are also investing. States as well as private sector are becoming parties where they invest in some of the technologies to clean up outer space, get rid of some of the space debris pieces. So some of the states that have invested in these technologies, for instance, a robotic arm to remove a particular satellite or maneuver a particular satellite. But the worry is that if you have the capability to today to reposition a particular satellite because it's coming close to one of your satellites or whatever, or a space debris, you can use the same capability tomorrow to on an adversary. So and we have not even begun the process of talking to each other on the legality of it, the regulatory aspects of these kind of activities on orbit satellite servicing options. We haven't even begun to look at these issues in a very concerted manner. So I think there are a range of capabilities that can be used in outer space that would essentially mean weaponizing outer space without actually putting in weapons in outer space. But sometime last month, you also had an event where Russia released a projectile into outer space from one of their Russian inspector satellite. Russia said this was not any anti-satellite. This was not a co-orbital ASAT or an anti-satellite test that they were engaged in. But much of the Western commentary, particularly the US, came out in very clear terms that this was a space weapon, and space weapon to be used for that first time in that sense, releasing a projectile into the outer space from within outer space. This was something that was done for the first time. So this marked a significant event for a lot of us, but Russia obviously said this was nothing unusual an operation, that this was their normal Russian satellite inspection operation. That is essentially they're sending a satellite to repair a particular satellite or remotely servicing a particular satellite, that there was nothing unusual about it. So these are the kind of activities that are taking place in outer space, in a sense, weaponizing outer space without actually placing a weapon in outer space. And that's the difference between militarization and weaponization. Militarization refers to a range of activities that are somewhat seen as passive, intelligence gathering, surveillance, and so on and so forth. Those are come to be somewhat more acceptable in today's world, because every major military today uses space for these applications.
Fascinating insights, Raji. The follow-up question, quickly to this is, you talked about, things like weapons and, space debris. I know that, for example, there is no international accepted definition of where space exactly starts. Does the international community also suffer from not having, or for example, is there a internationally accepted definition as to what is a space weapon or what is a space debris, and how countries can accept each other's terminologies?
I think that's a $1 million challenge even now, and I was fortunate to be part of the UN, one of the UN efforts that happened over the last couple of years. In 2018, the UN had formed the UNGGE, the group of governmental experts on PAROS. That's the instrument, the prevention of arms race in outer space. This has been a measure that has been debated, discussed from UN within the UN General Assembly from 1985 onwards. It comes to CD, but there has not been a single substantive discussion on PAROS even now. But there was a more concerted effort with this particular UNGG that was constituted in 2018, 2019. And I was part of the UNGG as a technical advisor. So I had the chance of being in the two-week long meetings in 2018 and 19. And one can see how divided the house is when you talk about how do you define a space weapon or space debris, and whatever in that sense. You cannot, there's no clear understanding of what's peaceful use of outer space. In the 1960s, you had a very somewhat more limited use of a limited understanding of peaceful use of outer space. But today, with activities expanding in outer space, states expanding their activities in outer space, states have also come to a broader understanding or definition of how you would indicate what a peaceful use of outer space is. Similarly, you do not have a clear definition of what weaponization of outer space, or what a space weapon is, or what a space debris is. And space debris, for instance, many countries do want to discuss space debris within the context of the security and strategic side of developments within space. But there is another group of countries which prefer that space debris is a very civilian-oriented subject, and that it should be discussed only in Vienna, for instance, that is within the UN Corpus, UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, and that it is not for the Conference on Disarmament, which is the Geneva-based UN body for strategic sector of the space thing, to debate. So this kind of a institutional sort of a differences as to where some of these issues fall, whether they should fall within the UN Corpus in Vienna or within the Conference on Disarmament CD in Geneva. This has been a major debate with no clear solution or no clear understanding of how this is to be done. So the UN Corpus is a fairly representative body with a large number of countries as members, and it has the backing of all the major players and so on and so forth. But the one big lacunae of the UN Corpus is that it has a limited mandate. The limited mandate that it only has mandate over the peaceful and civilian applications of outer space activities. It does not concern with space security or space arms control issues. None of those issues are going to be developed or going to be discussed or developed within the framework of the UN Corpus. So you have that organization, an effective organization, but because of the limited mandate, that is not going to be addressing such kind of issues. But having said that, I must add that there has been a space debris mitigation guidelines that has been developed by the Corpus. So in a sense, they have somewhat expanded their scope in a way to say that space debris, it can also be a result of a lot of natural active actions in space, and therefore we might expand the mandate to include space debris issues and so on and so forth. But I think when the PAROS GG was in debate over 2018-19, you could see that there were a lot of countries who felt that space debris also needed to be debated within the context of the CD, the Conference on Disarmament, and within the security side of things, because space debris is also created as a result of the number of ASAT tests and such kind of activities in outer space. So I think it's going to be very difficult to bridge the gap between these two philosophical approaches propounded by two sets of countries, and two groups of countries. So you have one school of thought which believes that you do not discuss space debris and such kind of things within Corpus, within CD, and the other belief. But I think there is also a larger difference between two of these two schools in a sense. One school of thought which is which believes that legally binding verifiable measures are what is required to keep space secure, safe, and sustainable. But there is another group, predominantly the Western countries, which believe that legally binding measures are not going to be able to be, are not going to be developed in the near term. And therefore, and otherwise also, they have a preference for normative exercise, which is to go for transparency and confidence building measures, TCBMs. And I so far have found such difficulty to bring some sort of a consensus, some sort of an agreement between these two groups to sort of find some compromise to say that, okay, fine, maybe TCBMs are the first step towards a sort of a developing a legally binding mechanism and so on and so forth. So on any number of issues, whether it is space debris, defining some of these key concepts, whether it is space debris, space weapon, defensive use of outer space, peaceful use of outer space, or none of these issues, there is clarity on what needs to be done. But I believe that if for any future mechanism, whether it is a normative kind of a mechanism or a legally binding measure, you have to have a sense of clarity. And unless you have the definitional clarity on what each of these terms mean to you countries, it is going to be very difficult to come out with an effective measure, because you don't know what you're trying to limit or what you're trying to control. And unless you define and say, this is exactly what we are trying to limit through this particular TCBM or through this particular legally binding measure. And given the kind of challenges in developing consensus among the major powers today, I find it extremely challenging to develop a sort of any sort of measure, rules of the road for outer space activities in the near term. It's unfortunate that countries have come to this particular state of the play, and that's most of these difficulties are driven by the geopolitical issues, not because the countries do not understand the challenges challenges of these kind of activities or kind of these new threats and challenges. But the fact is that they do not want to agree to it. There are also disagreements among states in terms of what are the challenges. For instance, Russia, China, and a group of other countries believe that weaponization of space or arms control, arms race in outer space is a much bigger challenge. They do not see space debris as a big challenge. Whereas there is another group of countries which believe that space debris is already a huge challenge today, and that there has to be something done about it today itself. In fact, Daniel Porras, who used to be with UNIDER and now he's with the Secure World Foundation, he and I brought out an edited book a few years ago when there was this European Union had proposed an international code of conduct for outer space. So we had brought out a book compiling views from a number of different officials as well as some from the think tank world policy community. One of the chapters was written by an Ecuadorian official. His chapter title was "It Happened to Us." Essentially, he was referring to the fact that their one and only satellite was hit by a space debris. So he knew that what he was talking about, the space debris for him, for Ecuadorians, it was already a huge challenge, destroying one of their one and only satellite at that point of time. So in a sense, space debris is a challenge that is not for tomorrow. It is a challenge from yesterday onwards, and it's becoming much larger a problem already today. And unless you are able to kind of deal with it, this is going to be a serious issue in a sense. Whereas Russia, China combined have a sort of a emphasis on, for instance, arms race as the bigger challenge. So there are problems among these key space players in identifying and agreeing upon which are the challenges first and foremost. Then, of course, what are the possible ways, possible solutions going into the future? Again, like I said, the two philosophical schools of thought. One which believes that legally binding mechanisms are the best way to go about. The second school of thought, which believes that transparency and confidence building measures are the best ways. In 2018, in the preparatory work towards the UNGG, there was a meeting in Beijing, which I had gone to, which was a UN meeting. And so there was even a proposal at that stage to say, maybe we can have legally binding, legal TCBMs. So it is still a transparency and confidence building measure. Those are TCBMs, but you can have some sort of a legally binding mechanism attached to it so that there is sanctity to it. Because many of the opponents to TCBM say that what's the validity of a TCBM if you cannot hold a country responsible, if you can't hold a country responsible, for instance, if they have violated a particular commitment. So the proposal was that, okay, fine, we will introduce a legal element to these TCBMs so that you can hold that particular country responsible should it break a commitment or something of that kind. But again, building consensus on this particular issue again has been hugely problematic, and I don't think you have seen much of an positive ground to it. I'm not sure how long we are going to wait before we are ready to develop an effective rules of the road for outer space, because space is not going to wait. Space is getting more crowded, to use the most cliched thing. Space is crowded, congested, and contested given the geopolitical tensions, but that's also true. So unless you make a concerted effort to regulate certain activities, bring about certain restraining effect on certain states from engaging in certain irresponsible activities, you are going to be landing in a space where you may not be able to access outer space in an uninterrupted fashion for a very long time.
Raji, you talked about several forums, including UN Corpus, the Conference on Disarmament, PAROS, group of governmental experts, so many of them. So the question is, why do you have so many of these forums discussing space security, and how successful are they, and what has been India's role in them?
So in terms of forums, there are two major ones, which is the one in Vienna, which is the UN Corpus, the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. The security side of space and the arms control aspects of outer space are discussed in Geneva at the CD, or the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. So these are the two bodies primarily responsible for outer space activities. Then you have the first committee, UN First Committee, and the fourth committee, again, dealing with various aspects of space. But when it comes to two major institutions discussing space activities, the COPUOS and the CD are the pertinent ones. The PAROS is a sort of an instrument that is still being developed, but it doesn't have the requisite support. So PAROS is not necessarily an institutional mechanism, but it's more of a sort of something like the OST, Outer Space Treaty, still being developed. It's been talked about for the more than 3 decades, but it still doesn't have the kind of support that is required to make it into a sort of a living organism, so to say. So PAROS has been being, like I said, it hasn't had a substantive discussion in places like the CD for the longest time, and CD itself has been in a state of stalemate for more than 20 years now. The last serious item that was discussed in CD was in 1996, the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. After that, there has not been, and even then it was becoming a serious problem, and that's why the CTBT and some of these debates went into other platforms and so on and so forth. So the CD has been in a state of stalemate for more than 2 decades, to the point that they do not even agree upon an actionable agenda for the platform. So there is nothing that is significantly going to change within the CD in the immediate future. I've seen many efforts taken by some of the governments to see, in fact, even bringing civil society interactions to see if the civil society can come out with a new formula on how the CD can be made to work in a unified fashion, in an effective fashion. But again, I was part of that particular exercise. I think this was about 3 or 4 years ago. But again, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed there. So I'm very doubtful that things are going to change in that fashion within the near term, so to say. So the number of platforms that are debating space are still limited, and but I think we need. Okay, let me put it this way: the great power competition is what is hindering the process of developing any space regime. That is, the kind of competition that is there between the US and China, for instance, US and Russia, or things of that kind, it's not going to get easy in the immediate time frame. I don't see a significant change in the bilateral or multilateral relations between some of these key players, in a sense, which means that I also feel that this is something that I've been trying to come up with the writing to say that there is space, there is scope, space for sort of some of the middle power countries, middle space players to come together to work out some of the technology aided solutions in outer space governance. If you're able to provide some of the, if you're able to invest, for instance, to start with, in some of the technologies and verifiable means to understand what is going on in outer space, use technology to verify if somebody is engaged in a space weaponization activity or not, I think that can be possibly a starting point to building some sort of a consensus at a later stage among the great players. So I do believe that you need to be more innovative. You need to bring in certain outside voices, outside perspectives, because if you're going to leave it to the great powers to talk to each other and develop the consensus among themselves to develop certain rules of the road for space, I think that's not going to happen for at least for the next couple of decades for sure.
Raji, of course, when a country flies a particular satellite, no one polices what they put in that satellite or how, what is exactly going on in that particular satellite. So, if a country X, flies a certain satellite, it has certain capabilities or even a certain weapon for that matter. A country Y, it's very hard for a country Y to decide, what kind of payload or what kind of, system capabilities that particular satellite has. So the whole nature of this makes it very hard for countries to police on each other as to what assets they have flying.
Yeah.
So how do countries, manage this kind of lack of transparency?
So I think currently, for instance, so I think this is again, okay, when we were debating under the UNGG. So the UNGG is again not an institution. Like, sorry, I left this bit on the previous question. So the UNGG is again is not a institution per se, but this was sort of an innovative measure, initiative taken by the United Nations to start some formal talks on some of the critical space security related issues. There was a UNGG a few years ago in 2013-14 on TCBMs, transparency and confidence building measures. And in 2018-19, this was on PAROS. So, and the UNGGs have been formed on other areas as well. You had one on lethally autonomous weapon system, the laws. You have something on cyber issues. So there have been every now and then the UN takes the initiative to develop these kind of institute these GGs so that you are able to have focused discussions on a particular theme. So that's something that has been happening for a while, and I think that's a good way to at least generate some good focused discussions in a sense. Currently, the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, so they allot the orbital slots to a particular country, and they are supposed to manage in terms of these satellite operations of that kind. They are supposed to regulate the operations to a large extent. But as part of the five agreements that are in place, in line with the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, one of the agreements is that registration agreement, registration convention. Under this particular instrument, a state is supposed to give full information of a satellite that is going to be launched, for instance. Today, the problem is that countries are not providing the full information. So in fact, they would just give the bare minimum information to say that their satellite is particular so-and-so satellite is going to be launched on such and such date, and maybe at best give the orbital slot where it's going to be launched, but not in terms of what is the purpose of the satellite and so on and so forth. So today, I think even a complete implementation of the existing agreements If that is done, I think that itself can contribute to greater transparency and confidence measure in outer space activities. Because today you don't have much of an idea as to what is going on with somebody else's space activities, what somebody else is up to. And there are complications also, not in just terms of states carrying what payloads, if they have disclosed the full information or not. That is one. But you have many, and these are mostly in the case of Western countries, they launch sort of commercial companies launching military payloads. So payloads, military payloads for a particular government. So there are, so it's just now, and also states as well as private sector players carrying mixed payloads. So a satellite can take actually both a civilian payload as well as a military payload. So there are, the satellite operations, space operations have become a lot more complex. The entry of different sets of players and also carrying mixed payloads and so on and so forth have made the space operation a lot trickier. So suppose somebody wants to target a particular state's asset, maybe state X wants to target state's Z's asset that is being launched. But tomorrow, if that is and under the assumption that that is a mixed military payload that is being carried, or a spy satellite, or whatever thing. But the fact is that if it has a mixed payload, how that's going to be interpreted as, that is one set of issues. A second, a more pertinent issue is also a private sector company is launching a military payload for a particular state. And if a particular, that particular operation has been attacked, targeted by state X, how should the private sector respond? How should the targeted states should respond to this? Again, these are completely gray areas with no clear understanding at this point of time in terms of what is to be done. There is a broader understanding that whatever happens and whoever is going to run, for instance, even if it's a private sector that is going to be running a certain set of activities, it is the states that are at the end of the day responsible for their activities as well. But I think it's easier said than done, and these are theoretically that is understanding, but in practical terms, when something happens, how these are going to be tackled, how these are going to be addressed, it's still not very clear in a sense. So I think this is becoming a lot more problematic. For instance, cyber operations in space, and how that can kind of very quickly possibly can contribute to conflict escalation. Because I think there are a couple of different questions, important questions to look at before one can actually get to the escalation point. I think there are issues there. It's not as simple, but I think there are, this will again fall into the gray zone issues in a sense. For instance, what should be the criteria for deciding that a cyber attack has actually taken place? And then building a consensus among states on that particular question. Again, it's not going to be an easy task. And it is likely that most states will agree that a cyber attack has taken place on a particular space object. If it leads to physical destruction of space assets or cause fatality of some kind to individuals. But it is possibly a lot more difficult to reach an agreement on this particular question when a state or a private sector has used cyber measures only to tamper with or to steal data or interfere with a sort of command and control system, but this does not lead to physical destruction of a space object or something of that kind. And I think so that's, these are issues that are making it a lot more complicated, and we still do not have how states should respond. It is unclear how states subject to such attacks, cyber attacks, for instance, or an electronic attack, can respond in a manner that would be considered legitimate under international law. What level of proof is required before a response is initiated, and what might cause exactly, for instance, proportionality in such responses. Because the international humanitarian law, IHL, has also been kind of poking its head in the space security debates, again, with varying different interpretations among states and how IHL, the international humanitarian law, should be applied in these kind of things. So we are looking at the space is getting so much more complicated with no clear understanding of how it should be governed, what are the rules of the road, whether we are ready to form rules of the road. On none of these issues, there is a clear sort of a consideration at this point of time. But I think India's own approach, for instance, I believe India is becoming a lot more pragmatic. For instance, I was again part of some of the debates when the International Code of Conduct out of outer space activities. Those debates were going on in 2011 to 12 to 14. Right now, it is in a state of coma. I don't think it is going to ever come out of the coma. But in the initial those stages in 2013-14 meetings, India had approached the ICOC, the International Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities, from a very pragmatic sense, wherein it took part in all of these debates. There were 3 open-ended consultations that happened. We were party to all of them. We made sort of active comments on each of these sessions, each of these issues. And with the understanding that we might start with a code of conduct or some sort of a voluntary measure, a political instrument, before actually developing the sort of a confidence and trust in each other to develop something like a legally binding measure. So India is beginning to see some of these, and of course, India's own neighborhood is changing in a big way in terms of security, geopolitical issues, not just related to space alone, but even in larger, broader geopolitical terms. So India is beginning to have a much more pragmatic approach to security, including in outer space.
Excellent, Raji. I think these insights are actually really, really fascinating to learn from an Indian perspective. So one of the things that you talked about is how countries manage their policy and so on. So when you look at what India has done with the nuclear policy, where they say no first use, and almost every Indian knows about this.
Yes.
What about having a space security policy for India as a country, and who's responsible for it to come through?
I think this has been debated for so long, at least among the community outside the establishment, so to say, whether it is ISRO or the Ministry of External Affairs and or the DRDO. But outside of some of these major establishments, I think this has been part of the public policy debate that India needs a space security policy in place. India needs a comprehensive space policy for sure. But we also need something very clearly spelled out in terms of where we are, in terms of our capabilities, in terms of where we want to go, what kind of space environment that we want to see, and how that needs to be developed and nurtured in a sense. And I don't think we have clarity on many of these aspects. But I think India is kind of beginning to put in place some of the building blocks, so to say, over the last close to 2 decades. Again, going back to the Chinese anti-satellite test in 2007, January, that prompted India to first come up with one of the institutional measures called the Integrated Defense Space Cell within the Integrated Defense Headquarters. That was the first baby step that India took in terms of developing an institutional kind of framework. Thereafter, now, come fast forward to now, I think we have set up a tri-service defense space agency. That's been a useful step, but I think that is still taking time to actually get set in place, and its mandate is somewhat clear, but I think there are issues that still need to be thrashed out. But the need for a space policy cannot be substituted by the institutional mechanisms. And I think I'm not entirely clear as to why India has been so hesitant, because when I talk to a lot of senior individual officers within the ISRO and other places, they all see the benefit to India coming out with a space policy articulation. So I'm like, where is the hurdle then? Where are we getting stuck, and why is it that we don't have? And I remember going to some of the military institutions for some speech, sort of remarks out there, from lectures there, and each time when I interact with the Army or the Air Force, they have said, oh, we have just given our set of comments from our feedback and comments on the space policy, but it's still not out. But I think it's the need of the hour is to have one comprehensive space policy, and also a military space policy, because I think it will send a clear message to one's own. I think it can bring about one institutional and functional clarity in terms of India's own goals and aspirations, Second, it can also be used as a message for a tool for messaging, both to your friends as well as your adversary. I think that is also a sort of a space policy should also be used as a messaging tool. And I think that's become extremely critical in the Indo-Pacific neighborhood, with the kind of security competition that is kind of picking up every single day. So I think India being hesitant about these things is not being helpful. India needs to have its doctrine, its strategy in place. But right after the Indian ASAT test in March 2019, the NSA was apparently had apparently given some direction to say that India should develop something like a space doctrine, just like the nuclear doctrine that we have, the draft nuclear doctrine, which actually spelled out the NFU policy, the no first use policy. But my sense is that space is somewhat slightly different from nuclear in that in many ways, and therefore uh, actually talking about operationalizing anti-satellite capability is not a healthy thing. It's actually destabilizing, it's dangerous. So far there are 3 countries that have demonstrated ASAT capability. You have US, Russia, and China. None of these countries have operationalized these capabilities and given it to the various military commands to actually start using them. So for India to think about, maybe India had not given because this came a few days after the ASAT test, so maybe we hadn't given much of thought in how this is to be used. And ASAT is also seen as a weapon of deterrence, not exactly to be used, because that is only we are going to further pollute the outer space also, and also give way to much more dangerous consequences in terms of our activities in outer space. So I think we need to be clear about how ASATs are not to be used. ASATs are not operational sort of weapons in that sense. It is to send a message, and the message for India, for instance, with the 2019 Mission Shakti was very clear, that it was sending a message to China that if you think of messing around with our satellites, we have precisely that technology to mess around with your satellites. So, don't do that. Don't engage in that kind of an activity with regard to Indian satellites. So that was a message for China, and that has been delivered. So you need not really go about operationalizing that capability and give way to more destabilizing consequences in outer space, making space a lot more trickier and dangerous a place. So I think we need to be clear about. Clearly, we need a space policy, but operationalizing ASATs and such kind of counter space capabilities should not become part of those kind of strategies.
So do you see a role for countries like India, France, US, Japan, Australia to coming together to do something related to space security that protects the assets of these countries together?
Absolutely. I think, in fact, we've ORF is also part of sort of working together with Australian think tank on a lot of technologies, not just space, but a number of different existing and emerging technologies, and looking at it in the context of these changing geopolitics, and to see whether there is a scope for countries like India and Australia, but also an expanded group, including countries like Indonesia, maybe Singapore, maybe Japan, for instance, South Korea, and the US, of course. Can these countries come together in developing technology policies, one, but also make technology easily accessible to a large number of countries in the Indo-Pacific region, because technology is unevenly available in the region, and there is a serious problem in terms of access to technology. Access to technology in the Indo-Pacific region or anywhere else is uneven. So how can India and other countries take the leading in making access to technology easier for many of these countries? And I think there is a way to do that. If India is able to India is one of the more established powers in this regard. India can collaborate with Japan and use some of the existing platforms. So in Asia, in the Asia Pacific scene, there are two organizations. One is the APSCO under the Chinese leadership, and then you have the APRSAF. Again, that's something for the Regional Space Security Cooperation, Space Cooperation. So India can actually use some of the existing institutional mechanisms in Asia to sort of give way for more cooperation among countries and so on and so forth, especially bring in some of the smaller powers who are in need of developing these capabilities but do not have the access to capabilities or the training and the institutions necessary for this. So there is scope for these countries to come together. There is also scope for many of the private sector enterprises in these countries to come together, because especially in addressing challenges from the counter space capabilities, whether it is cyber, electronic warfare, each of these capabilities and how that plays out in our space. I think private sector has also invested a great deal in terms of developing countermeasures and so on and so forth. So involving the private sector from these countries to develop effective deterrent measures, as well as sort of countermeasures to in a collaborative fashion for the region. There is scope for for across the board in terms of spreading technologies to smaller countries, but also in terms of developing countermeasures to some of the major space security threats and challenges. There as well, there's a possibility. And the third, of course, is the governance aspect, the global governance. Again, Indo-Pacific has some of the major middle space players like India, Australia, Japan. I think these three countries, for instance, can actually take the lead. But I think in terms of even I forgot to mention one other aspect with related to collaboration, for stepping up aid and assistance to some of the smaller countries, is the need for these countries to actually put together a technology fund. Some sort of a technology fund can also be developed by some of the major players in Indo-Pacific area, and so that you do have sufficient funds to kind of step up your assistance to some of the smaller countries. So I think there are a range of areas that, in terms of policy, in terms of technology, but also in terms of cooperation and collaboration, that can actually work in the Indo-Pacific region.
So the final question, Raji, is of course the podcast is actually having a lot of listeners who are young and motivated to step up into the space activities realm. So where can people learn a lot more about space, security, and be involved as a part of the whole space security community as young people?
So I think there are a number of space specific think tanks and other institutions that are coming up. Space is generally considered a lot more niche area. But even then, I think there are a number of educational institutions, as well as think tanks, both within India and also across the world practically. There are within ORF, there's a small initiative we run looking at the space and some of the other technology issues. There are other universities. Amity is doing some amazing program with regard to their aerospace and science and technology program. There are other institutions, of course, that are also coming up. So there are few places that are available, places like IDSA, the Institute for Defense Studies Analysis. So there are, for youngsters who are just passing out from college and kind of thing, I think these can be the first places to step into, just get a sense of the policy, space security policy debates and so on and so forth, see whether this is something that they feel comfortable with and so on and so forth. Then there are globally, I think there are a number of different institutions. Secure World Foundation, which is a US-based space-specific think tank, has been doing some amazing work in this regard. CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, again, a Washington DC based think tank. In fact, both of these think tanks have been coming out with a space, from a space security perspective, something really worth important. They have been, for the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, I think 3 years in a row, they have come out with a global assessment on counter space capabilities. So, there are a number of different agencies, institutions that are beginning to now work on space across the board, but I think space security is also beginning to assume a significant chunk of their work. So I think there's nothing that could possibly stop the young minds from entering this domain. It's an interesting domain. There are a lot of interesting debates. It's challenging, but I think there are also, you can come up with innovative measures, innovative thinking in how some of the old challenges can be dealt with and kind of thing. So it's an interesting and challenging at the same time.
Thank you very much, Raji. It's been a very insightful, episode discussing so many different aspects of space security, and let's
Thanks.
hope that the whole policy issue matures over time, and we should do a follow-up episodes on many of the other issues that we possibly missed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on this show, and I would love to do a follow up conversation at some stage in the future. And looking forward to it. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, I just also want to plug in the Kalpana Chawla Space Policy Dialogue here, and you have been
Absolutely
doing a lot of great work with creating that platform. And today, I guess that platform has matured as the most significant platform for
right,
space policy dialogue in India,
right.
and that I've had always a pleasure of attending it, and I also recommend people to come to Delhi to attend that.
Thank you so much for that shout out. And it has emerged as a major platform, bringing together all the different stakeholders from everybody from commercial world to security and safety and space exploration folks to everyone. So it's been a fascinating journey. We have done 5 editions. So I look forward to continuing that conversation, keep that conversation floating alive. Thanks so much, Narayan.
Yeah.
Thank you.